the city and across the country on Facebook and on YouTube, and we're delighted to have you here. I know that you're like you, yeah, all of our fingernails have been chewed off, but maybe we'll put aside for just a few moments the election and the all of the drama of the election, and enjoy a little bit of Torah study, a little bit of learning together. So I'm really glad that you're with us. This we've been looking together at the book of Psalms. And as I've said many times now, the book of Psalms is a unique book in the Bible because it's really entirely the emotional life of the Jewish people from the period of the middle of the first temple period until the beginning of the second temple period. So what we're dealing with here is not theological speculations or theological imaginations, philosophical contemplation. What we're dealing with are the feelings of people as they experience life, as they experience the drama of the events of their day, as they experience the world of nature, as they experience life and death. It's the drama of human existence that is reflected in this book. It's poetry, and it's poetry that is filled with all of the whole repertoire, basically, of human emotions, and all of the conflicts of our emotions, the moments of being happy and sad and bitter and sweet, of difficulty, of challenge, and an overcoming, of redemption. All of these emotions are reflected in this remarkable collection in the book of Psalms. And if there's a theological underpinning to this book, it's the fundamental idea that we, as the Jewish people, as Israelites, as children of Jacob, we are the chosen of the God of the universe, the chosen of this God. And so when we are directing our either our gratitude or our wonder at the world about us, or our disappointment and our frustration and our rage at the world about us, it's directed toward God. And we'll see that today. It's a unique and interesting set of Psalms. So we began last week, if those of you are with us, with a set of Psalms which I like to call the Psalms of protest. These are Psalms that are reflecting on the difficulties of living in the world, the injustices of the world, and they aren't so much registrations of that injustice as they are screams of protest to a God. How can you let this happen? How can you allow this in your world? Now, one of the theological points that I want to point out, because it's very apropos to happens to be this week's Torah portion. In this week's Torah portion from the book of Genesis, we have a remarkable statement, and of course we'll spend some serious time on Shabbat dealing with this particular text, and I want to show it to you because I want to just point this out as we get into the Psalms. It's the 18th chapter of the book of Genesis. So Abraham, having been chosen, as it were, and designated to be a blessing in the world, to represent God in the world, Abraham is visited by three angels at the beginning of this week's Torah portion. They appear as visitors, and he offers them dinner, and then at the dinner they reveal themselves as angels. And the first angel tells them that he and Sarah are going to be parents, and now the second two angels have another mission. And the men, that's the angels, set out from there to look down towards Sodom. Abraham lives in Kiryat Arba, which is just on the outskirts of Hebron, and what he's looking for, and what these angels are doing, is looking down into the Rift Valley, looking down to see what's happening below. And what's below is a city called Sodom, and the city of Sodom is a great and powerful city. It's a city of some serious wealth and serious power, and it's also a city with a terrible reputation. Abraham walking along. Now, the Lord had said, shall I hide from Abraham what I'm going to do? And on Shabbat, we'll spend some time on this because that's such an extraordinary question. I mean, the ostensible answer, of course you should hide from Abraham, you're God. But now that God has taken a partner, as it were, that God owes Abraham an explanation, because Abraham is going to be the one who is responsible for doing what is just and right, for being God's ambassador of justice and righteousness in the world. And therefore, he has to be clued in on what God's plans are. And God says the outrage of Sodom and Gomorrah is so great, their sin is so grave, I want to go down and see. And Abraham learns from this, he doesn't quite tell you how, that it's God's plan to destroy the city as recompense for its evil. And here he steps up, and this is one of the greatest speeches in the entire Bible. And it's certainly one of my favorite speeches. Abraham comes forward, Vayigash Avraham, he steps up, he steps into the moral encounter. And here's the speech, here's the soliloquy. Will you sweep away the innocent along with the guilty? What if there be 50 innocent in the city? Will you wipe out the place and not forgive it for the sake of the innocent 50? Far be it from you. The Hebrew is chalila lecha. Far be it from you is much too placid, much too pariv, an interpretation of that phrase. Chalila lecha is a scream of protest. It's like, God forbid, right? It's God forbid, or worse, it's what my bubby used to yell when she got really mad at me. She'd say, Shanda necherpa. It's, I'm ashamed of you. That's what chalila lecha really means. I'm ashamed of you to do such a thing. To kill the innocent and the guilty together, to bring death upon innocent as guilty. And the Hebrew is really very much more direct. So that innocent and guilty Pharaoh, like the Hebrew is much more direct. It's vahaya, and so it would be katzadik karasha. That the innocent, the tzaddik, the righteous, and the rasha, the evil, would be the same. Is that the world you wanted, says Abraham to God? A world where there's no moral differentiation? No separation between good and evil, between innocent and guilt, between right and wrong. Is that the world you wanted? Kat tzaddik karasha. So goes the tzaddik, so goes the rasha. There's no differentiation. Far be it from you. It's repeated, and then the zinger, hashofet kol haaretz lo yaseh mishpat. Shall the judge of all the earth not do justice? Shall the judge of all the earth not do justice? So what you get here is what the Talmud likes to call covenantal chutzpah. I mean, what kind of chutzpah does it take to tell God you can't do this? What kind of chutzpah does it take to challenge God himself? What kind of chutzpah does it take to tell God that this is unjust? And what's remarkable here, well, there's two things that are remarkable here. Number one is, where does Abraham get this idea from? Typically in religious circles, when we think about believing in God, one of the arguments that we make for the necessity of an idea of God, a necessity of a relationship with God, is that God is the source of our morals. That without a God, is there really a sense of right and wrong? That God is the source of right and wrong, that right and wrong revests in God, as it were. But here, this text has a very different idea. Because for Abraham to be able to say to God, shall not the judge of all the earth do justice? What's indicated then is that Abraham's idea of justice, Abraham's idea of what's right, Abraham's idea of how the world should be governed doesn't come from God. It comes from someplace else. And he's throwing it back at God. He's throwing it back at God and saying, you are also judged by this same independent idea of justice. And we're going to, and the reason I raise this today is that we're going to see the exact same phenomenon in the book of Psalms. The psalmist, or rather the speaker of the psalm, there's not one psalmist, but the poet who writes the psalms we're going to be looking at today, is going to be shaking a finger at God. Now, if God is the source of all that is right and wrong, on what basis do you shake a finger at God? If God is the source of all that is right and wrong, all you can do is say, yes, sir. But the reason you can shake a finger at God is because you have an independent sense of what is just. You have an independent sense of what is right. And God, at least in your estimation, is also to be judged, is also to be accountable to that independent sense of justice. And that is a very radical religious idea, that we and God share a common moral language. Now, it's not universal. That is, there are other ideas of God in the Bible. One of the most amazing ones is the book of Job. But before we go to the book of Job, look at the next line. I mean, here's this great line. So Abraham has this zinger of a speech, which ends with this powerful charge, shall not the judge of all the earth do justice? And the Lord answered, If I find within the city 50 innocent, I'll forgive the whole place. And then you go on with the bargaining. They go down to 10. Now, what's remarkable here about this is that God accepts the rebuke. I mean, God accepts the rebuke. Like, and you got to ask yourself, like, why did God? I wondered if God regretted at that point having, elevated this big-mouthed Jew to become his partner, because, like, if he would have gotten some nice, quiet, subservient, obsequious servant, then the guy would have said, "Of course, do whatever you want, God." And instead, he gets this big-mouthed Jew who's telling him what to do. But the idea that God goes along, I mean, someone once said, Jackie Mason, remember the comedian Jackie Mason? He said the greatest Jew who ever lived was Menachem Begin, and he'll go down into history for his famous words, "All right, okay, fine, all right." Right? This idea that Abraham charges God with the injustice, with this conspiracy to commit injustice, and God says, "Okay, you're right. Give me 50, I'll give you the city." Then, of course, Abraham says 45. "Okay, give me 45. He says 40. "Okay, I'll take 40. How about 30? 30, I'll take 30. Give me 20. 20, I'll take 20. 10. Will you take 10? God says, "All right, 10, I'll take 10. Long story about why he doesn't go down to 1, but that's another story. But the notion, the absurdity of the story is to point out this idea, Abraham's chutzpah, and God's willingness to say, okay, why? Because God is more impressed that Abraham has in fact internalized his role as being the ambassador of justice and righteousness, and that he's not afraid to confront even the master of the universe in the name of justice. And that's a beautiful picture for who we are as a people. It's a beautiful picture of what's expected of a Jew, of what's expected of a person who is a descendant of Abraham. Now, just to give you the contrast, and I promise you we will get to the book of Psalms in a minute, take a look at another biblical book. It's been my conviction always that the Talmud isn't the only Jewish book written in dialogues. The Bible is also written in dialogues. It's just that it's harder to find them. You have to go find the countertext elsewhere in the Bible. And I would argue that the countertext to Genesis 18 is the book of Job. Now, the book of Job, we should do the book of Job one year. The book of Job is a book that we Jews don't often read. In fact, most Jews think it's in the Christian New Testament. In fact, it's in our Bible. And it's a book about a guy who is righteous and good and suddenly suffers. And we know why he suffers. We know why, because there's a prologue to the book that tells us the story that God was bragging about him to Satan, who is not devil Satan, but this sort of the God's alter ego. And Satan said, sure, take away the wealth and take away his power and take away his health, and you'll see that he'll curse you like all the other men. And God says, okay, but don't kill him. And that's the reason why Job is suffering. We know, because we read the prologue, that Job is an innocent man who suffers. And he raises his voice and he says, this isn't right. Why am I suffering? Number one, why am I suffering? I didn't do anything to deserve this. That's unjust. And number two, if I'm suffering and it's because I did something, tell me what I did. But by not telling me what I did, what good does it do to make me suffer? I can't do tshuva, as it were, for a sin I don't know I did. And number three, what could I possibly have done that was so terrible to deserve all of this? And you still won't tell me what it is. And so for 35 chapters, he complains to God. And he says, how can you do this? And there's a whole dialogue with the neighbors who come over and they defend God. They defend God. And if you look at the book of Job carefully, and we won't do it this minute, but there are so many hints in this book that it's responding directly back to the Genesis text. For example, look at chapter 9, right? Job says to himself, I should sue God in court. It's a good Jewish idea, right? Somebody once said there's a new kosher sushi restaurant, so sue me, So what we get is he says, I'm going to sue God, but I know man cannot win a suit against God. If he insisted on a trial with God, God would not answer one charge in 1,000. Wise of heart and mighty in power, whoever challenged God and came out whole? Whoever said to him, what are you doing? Now, we know the answer to that question. Abraham is the answer to that question. But this is a text which goes against Abraham. It's the opposite text. This is the text that reflects the human experience of suffering without the response, without understanding why. Though I were right, I could not speak out because I would plead for mercy with my judge. If I summon him, he wouldn't respond. I do not believe he would lend me his ear. Right? Though I were innocent, my mouth would condemn me. Though I were blameless, he would prove me crooked. I mean, he would twist the court proceedings, and I would lose in the end anyway. I am blameless. I am distraught. I am sick of life. It is all one. Therefore, I say he destroys the blameless and the guilty. Just to remind you, remember the line in Genesis, right? Right? Will you wipe out the city? Far be it from you to bring death upon the innocent as the guilty, so that innocent and guilty fare alike. And here Job says, yeah, that's exactly what he does. And then at the end of the book of Job, God shows up and he says to Job, shut up. He basically shows up in a tempest, which is a hurricane. And he said, who is this who darkens counsel, speaking without knowledge? Gird your loins like a man. I'll ask you, inform me. And then he takes him on a tour of the universe. And he shows him all the things, and he says, where were you when I built the world? Where were you when I put the stars in the sky? Where were you when I taught lions to roar and horses to gallop and fish to swim? Who do you think you are anyway? And at the end, Job gives in. And Job says, I know you can do everything, that nothing you propose is impossible. Who is this who obscures counsel? Without knowledge, I spoke without understanding, which I didn't know. Here now I will speak. I will ask you, inform me. I had heard you with my ears. Now I see you with my eyes. I recant and relent, being but dust and ashes. There's only two places in the whole Hebrew Bible where a guy says, I am but dust and ashes. This one, which signals Job's surrender to God's power. I surrender my complaint. And guess where else? Yup, Genesis 18. But here it's meant ironically. After God says, okay, give me 50 good guys, I'll save this city. Abraham says, I venture to speak, my Lord, I who am but dust and ashes. What if the 50 lack 5? In Abraham's case, the statement is ironic. I'm dust and ashes, but I got an argument against you. In Job's case, it's meant realistically, I'm only dust and ashes, I have no claim. The point here is that the Genesis idea that a human being can hold God up to a standard of justice was not something that is reflected in all of our human experience. There are many times when stuff happens and we say, how can this possibly be right? How can this possibly be just? And the book of Job represents a different attitude toward God, a different attitude toward the world, where Abraham protests the injustice. Job sucks it up, we would say, and accepts it. And this is the argument that goes on in the Bible. So now we open the book of Psalms and we take a look and see what the book of Psalms does with this very stuff. So take a look. Well, not that one. Yeah, not that one either. Yeah, this one here. Here's Psalm 94. Okay, and notice here what the psalm is. Notice how the psalm does this, right? Notice how the psalm protests. Okay, it starts with God of vengeance. Now, most of us don't think of God as God of vengeance, God of retribution. Appear. So this is an angry man. The speaker of this psalm is an angry guy. What is he angry about? Rise up, judge over, give the arrogant their deserts, what they deserve, right? How long shall the wicked, O Lord, how long shall the wicked exalt? Shall they utter insolent speech? Shall all evildoers vaunt themselves? They crush your people, O Lord. They afflict your very own. They kill the widow and the stranger. They murder the fatherless, thinking the Lord does not see it. The God of Jacob does not pay heed. So what's his basic belief? Let's get to the theology before we get to the emotions. His basic belief is, of course, that God is in charge of the universe. God has taught us justice. And yet, when I look into the universe and see how the world is conducted, I don't see that justice. What I see is injustice. I see that the weak and the vulnerable, widow, stranger, fatherless, are the Bible's 3 words for the disempowered, for the vulnerable. And we're supposed to protect them. And yet the arrogant, the evil destroy them, and they're arrogant about it because they go around saying, yeah, there's no God. There's no God in the world. It doesn't matter how I behave. There is no moral standard and there's no moral authority. And the psalmist is enraged that there's no moral authority. I mean, all of us have these moments of rage, I suppose. And I guess if you were watching the election last night, I'm sure you probably had a few of them. But, when the world isn't what we think it's supposed to be, and we say, where is the goodness? Where is the righteousness? Where is the power that holds immorality to account? And you can now the emotion of this. So the theology is very clear, but the emotion of this is so angry. It's a righteous indignation, a righteous anger, right? Take heed, you most brutish people. Fools, when will you get wisdom? Shall he who implants the ear not hear? He who forms the eye not see? Shall he who disciplines nations not punish? He who instructs men in knowledge, the Lord knows the designs of men to be futile. You'll get yours, he says. So first you get this, the first emotion, the first statement is a statement that I'm frustrated because I see evil about me and there doesn't seem to be anybody who cares. God doesn't care. And then he comes back and says, but I do have faith that there's a God who watches. And someday, somehow, somewhere, right, retribution will come. Punishment will come. That will happen in the world. That's his conviction. So there's a dialectic between these two verses of the psalm, a real big dialectic. Then he goes on and he says, I'm sorry, I missed that one. Let me go down a little bit. There we go. Happy is the man whom you discipline, O Lord, the man you instruct in your teaching, to give him tranquility in times of misfortune until a pit be dug for the wood. So it's interesting, this idea that happy is the man who you discipline. So he says, my suffering, all right, I'm willing to accept my suffering because it teaches me something. It teaches me to be patient. It teaches me to wait for God's justice, okay? And gives me tranquility in times of misfortune until a pit be dug for the wicked. I mean, I know that it's going to happen someday, but when will it happen? And now here's his faith again. For the Lord will not forsake his people. He will not abandon his very own. Judgment shall again accord with justice, and the upright shall rally to it. I have faith that somehow in the end, right will win. That's my faith in a God of the universe. But as soon as he makes that statement of faith, then he reverts to the previous emotion, which is his doubt, which is his rage, which is his disappointment, which is his frustration. Who will rise up for me against evil men? Who will stand for me against wrongdoers? Were not the Lord my help, I would dwell in silence. When I think my foot has given way, your faithfulness or supports me. When I'm filled with cares, your assurance soothes my soul. All right, but I'm waiting for it. I mean, I got faith in you, God. I got faith in you, but it's taking a little longer than it should, right? Shall the seat of injustice be your partner? Now that's an amazing line. Like the seat is where the judge sits, shall injustice be your partner? Shall that be the frame that frames mischief by statute? What a great line that is. They band together to do away with righteousness. They condemn the innocent to death. He's expressing his doubt. Like, I have faith in you, but it's getting harder. It's getting harder. It's getting harder. I need you to step up. I need you to step up. But the Lord is my haven. The Lord, now he goes back to the other one. So you can see the dialectic. He will make the evil recoil upon them, annihilate them through their own wickedness. The Lord our God will annihilate them. So you get this remarkable dialectic, this oscillation, this back and forth between his full faith in a God of justice who inhabits the world and will one day make it all right, and between his own empirical experience that people who do wrong seem to do rather well in the world, and that they arrogantly claim that there's no moral standard to which they will be held accountable. And it's that dialectic the frustration of that dialectic, of that back and forth, the tension that he reflects in this particular psalm. So here you get, you get both. You get the Abraham voice protesting the injustice and waiting for God's justice, and you also get the Job voice, which is like, why? Why is it like that? Why does it have to be like this? Why aren't you stepping in to fix these things? Let's stop for just a moment and see. Anyone have anyone questions? We've gone a whole half the hour. Who's got questions? All right, Stanley, you're first, and then Bert.
Thank you. It seems to me that it kind of refutes the God of the Torah that we read about and says that the image of a God, if we want to live it, is more of a God within than a God without. And
well, that's one of the answers. I mean, so one of the answers to this is if you're upset about the injustice of the world, go do something about it. Don't wait for a God from outside to come in and reconcile the injustices of the world. It ain't going to happen in your time. So get out there and do it yourself. That's an answer, and it's an answer, by the way, that you'll see elsewhere in the Torah. You certainly see it in the Torah, and you see it in the Bible. But here, I don't think it's here. I think he really is waiting. I mean, I think that the notion is he's waiting for God's justice to enter the world. That's what he starts out by saying, God of vengeance, God of retribution. That's how the whole psalm is addressed. This is the idea, and I got to tell you, Stan, as sophisticated as all of us are, and I know you are, I think that deep down, all of us who had parents when we were little kids who protected us still have this inner child that wants to believe that somewhere there's a parental power that's going to reach into our experience and make it right. That's going to protect us. That's going to it's going to have retribution over the bullies of the world.
You're right. That's human nature.
Well, that's what I'm saying. I don't think maybe it's not human nature. I think it's the product of being raised by loving parents, right? So the guy who's tailgating me and then swoops around and zooms by me on the freeway at 100 miles an hour, and I'm fully expecting there to be a highway patrol person just around the next bend, right? That's the God of vengeance that he's praying to. I think that's what he's saying. I think he's trying to say, if I do believe in a God of justice, where is he in a world? Why isn't he stepping forward? And what bothers him is two things. One is the destructive behavior, the immoral behavior. We said killing the widow and the orphan, right? And the other is the arrogance to think that they can do this and get away with it, that they can do this and no one's watching, that they can do it and there's nothing accountable. And that's a really interesting moral, call it a moral emotion, a moral sentiment, right? That what pisses me off more, what gets me angrier, isn't just the bad behavior, but it's the bad behavior and the insolence to think that I don't even have to hide it because there's nothing that's going to happen to me. I'm somehow insulated from the moral consequences of my bad behavior. There you go. I mean, then that's a really interesting moral emotion, right? Bert, what do you got?
Well, I guess I could use the metaphor relative to the arrogance of the last 4 years. But my question is, it also sounds like Job's lament is like the Jews not understanding why the Holocaust.
Yeah.
I mean, there's lots of such things, but that'll start your conversation.
No, you're exactly right. Job's lament is he's lived a righteous life very consciously. If you read the first 2 chapters, he's very, very conscientious in his righteousness. And suddenly misfortune, like serious misfortune, the catastrophe comes. And he raises his voice toward heaven and says, what are you doing? How can this be? His expectation is that there should be justice in the world. And when it doesn't come, he raises his voice. And you've heard the phrase, the patience of Job. It lasts 2 chapters. For the next 35 chapters, he's just screaming. He's just screaming. And finally, at the end of the book, God comes and says, you have no place to no way to criticize me. You have no place to criticize me. I'm God, you're man, shut up. And he does. And that's what's really interesting about the end of the book, is we would expect him to answer like Abraham answered, which is, Hashofet kol haaretz lo yaseh mishpat, the judge of all the earth is responsible for justice. But at the end of the book of Job, Job resigns. He gives in. So there's two ways to read this, or there's many more than two ways to read it, but of the two ways to read, one way is to say, sometimes when faced with such massive injustice, it's best just to let go. Because the protest itself isn't good for us. And so you just let it go. The guy who zooms past me on the freeway, let it go. Let it go. The clerk who overcharged me, let it go. Okay? Because sometimes it's just not worth tearing yourself up to try, because you can't expect the world to be just. But then the other piece is the other response is to say, I'm disappointed in him. I'm disappointed in him because I would have preferred an Abraham answer, which is, no, I'm not going to let it go. I demand justice. Now, the Job answer gives you equanimity and tranquility, serenity, right? Which I think is why the book is so popular in Christian circles and so unpopular in Jewish circles, because Jews are not into serenity. I don't know if you knew that. But you don't go to synagogue for serenity. You don't go to a Pesach Seder for serenity. Jews and serenity are somewhat at war with each other, right? If you want serenity, there's a lot of nice places to go, but shul ain't it, right? Because Jewish life isn't about serenity. It's about the fight for justice, right? But Job is the quintessential serene religious character, is it a Buddhist character who absorbs it and lets it go, right? Abraham keeps fighting. So what do you get if you're Abraham? You don't get serenity. You get ulcers and heart attacks and overeating, but you get a sense of dignity for having fought for what was right. Now, the difference, by the way, just literarily, the name Job is not a Hebrew name. It's actually an ancient Mesopotamian name, because the story is an ancient Mesopotamian story. And what's so interesting is that the name Job in ancient Mesopotamian, in Akkadian, means everyman, John Doe. He is a cipher for the common human experience. And the common human experience is to see God in nature. And nature doesn't answer your quest for justice. It's going to rain on the fields of the righteous, and it's going to rain on the fields of the evil. The earthquake knocked down my house, and it knocked down the pornographer who lived next door. Actually, his house survived. My house got creamed, right? My insurance man made me sure I knew that. Because nature doesn't care who you are, right? Nature doesn't pay attention. This is Mordechai Kaplan, the great philosopher, once said, it's, if the bull is charging at you, it's not going to do any good to tell him that you're a vegetarian. Nature does what nature does. You can't tell a shark that you don't eat fish. I mean, it doesn't help. And that's what Job is. Job is about natural man who experiences God through nature, and nature doesn't have a moral conscience. Abraham experiences God through covenant, which is moral. And that's the difference between the two. Yeah, Bert, go ahead. And then David, you're next. David, you're next. You're next.
I think there's maybe something else that you hinted at and Rabbi Schulweis talks about when you said, well, why don't you go do something?
Yeah, well,
I can't do anything about Hitler, but I can try and heal the world in another way on my own, and maybe provide some satisfaction that there is good somewhere.
That was Schulweis's and many other answers. Post-Holocaust theology said, I can't look to the heavens to find God's justice. All I can look is within. And what gave Schulweis the evidence for that conviction was finding Christian rescuers. That even in the worst of circumstances, human beings step forward to pursue justice, testifies to me that there is a quality of moral transcendence within us. That is a quality that pushes me to do what's right, or the capacity to do what's right, even in the worst of circumstances. David, can you hear me?
Yeah, I got to answer the door. One of what you've said so far first reminds me of the issue. What I've been taught is about the partnership, and there's a partnership.
Yes.
And I think about that. Actually, I have conversations with God. I ask for help a lot. And what I was thinking that when you were talking about Abraham criticizing God, that God is happy about that. That's something that he wants from man, from Abraham, not just to be a passive follower. And when there are certain things for sure that I feel completely powerless over, and yet what I find is that as I ask for something, some kind of message, some kind of still small voice, that it comes to me faster than I expected, and that was just a wonderful experience. Sort of, well, why don't you try? But it's very quiet when that happens, and I find myself, it develops me as a human being. That's what I want to say. I am developed. I am continually expanded. I'm not just relying on an all-powerful God, and I'm not just relying on my own brilliance. I'm having this partnership and this dialogue, which causes me to grow as a human being.
And the question though is, what does it take to hear that voice? What discipline or what practice or what does it take? Because so many people don't hear it. I mean, assuming that the voice is real, but there's so much in the world that drowns it out. And can you cultivate a sensitivity to that? And that's a very, very interesting question.
I just read a book called The Spirituality of Imperfection.
Yeah.
And it's
I know this
a terrific book.
It's a nice book.
And it really is about, it's about our limitation, and yet the sort of paradox in accepting our limitation. I guess one of the things that happens, we become more part of the human race, and second, we become empowered in a certain backward way. And a lot of humility. When you say, what does it take? I have to humble myself constantly.
Right. And isn't it interesting that the most important prayer in the whole book is a statement taken from the book of Deuteronomy, which starts with the word Shema Yisrael, which means listen up, Jews. And that's what you stick on the door, and that's what you wrap around your arm, and that's what you wear around your neck, and that's what you say when you wake up in the morning, and that's what you say when you go to sleep at night. That the tradition keeps telling you, Shmuck, if you want to experience God in the world, you got to listen. You got to learn listening. And listening takes, as you said, humility, takes openness. It takes, think of the whole set. And we always think of Shema Yisrael, the important phrase is the end one, Adonai Echad, monotheism. Maybe it's the first two words, that listening is really the quintessential religious act. Candy and Norm, you got a question. Unmute, you're on. Hi.
Just what we've gone through and are going through now. We have a leader that says I can kill somebody in the middle of Broadway and no one will notice. No one will say anything. And on the other hand, we have just lost RBG and we now have Barrett. What does this say about where we are today? And how do we, in a humble fashion, ask God or listen to what God has to say about this situation?
Well, first of all, as all of the news commentators have said over and over again, I'm going to reserve comment until all the votes are counted. So, I think this is a very challenging time for American democracy. What's so interesting, and we heard these comments last night, is whoever's going to win this election is going to govern a very, very brutally divided country. And the question is, why are we so divided? And what is the nature of the division? And what are the differences in between us that cause us to see the world in such different ways? I mean, this is, I was a kid in 1968, when it was Humphrey against Nixon. But I remember certain things, and I've studied that election as an adult. but I can't remember an election since then in which we felt that, which the two sides were so brutally divided, in which each side saw the other side as a real existential threat to the country. And there were elections, and we've had elections where we had candidates, and you said, okay, if the other guy wins, it's not who I wanted. I don't like his policies. I don't like the way he would deliver the country, but he was a decent human being. Remember John McCain's famous statement about Obama when that lady started yelling and he was a Muslim and a terrorist, and McCain said, no, ma'am, he's a very, very fine man. I mean, and the idea is that we can look at each other and see, have some common ground as Americans who share this democracy. But this election, boy, whew. And so the question really is, how do you deal with it? How do you deal with these cultural differences? And what happens to us? Can you govern a country this way? Go ahead, Norm. Go ahead. Yeah, unmute.
I participated in the 1968 convention.
Yeah.
I knew some of the Chicago Seven and appeared in that courtroom.
Right.
Secondly, I don't think we were divided as a people at that time anywhere near as we are now. And I think now my thinking and Candy's is there's really little or no hope for this country. It's time to leave.
Oh, stop it.
I don't know what to say. I think what we've been reading indicates that there's a dispute over fact. It's been a dispute between God and Abraham over what to do about the facts.
Yeah.
But there's never been a dispute over what the facts were.
Or that there are facts,
There are facts. Yeah. This is different. This is not 1968. Right. I can't remember. I'm a lot older than you, but I can't remember any time like this.
You're right. Doris Kearns Goodwin, who's the brilliant historian, made the case that we've never been as divided now since the Civil War. That this is Civil War level disagreement, and you get a sense. I mean, as if you study the Civil War, that the differences are deeply cultural. And not just simply, I like this guy's policies or I like that guy's policies. There really is a sense that we live in different worlds. And the fact question is one of those questions. You're exactly right. Stanley, and then we're going to get back to Assam. Go ahead.
Okay, I just wanted to mention that our Jewish tradition teaches us that we should respect differences, even wide differences. That's the whole way that the Talmud is written. It's the way that our Bible is written in different views. And it's the way that we study. When Hafruta is to try to have someone who has a different view to compare our view to. It's not to say, there's only one way to look at things. In fact, I want to know how to reconcile my view, even if it's the majority or whether it's a minority, with what other views there are. And we have a culture now that doesn't respect that, but we have a tradition that does.
Yeah, here's the question, and I really don't want to get into the politics of this because that's not what this class is for. But here, you're exactly right. We do have a very strong tradition of respecting pluralism, of differences of opinions on very important issues. The difference was that even though we differed about, is it kosher, is it treif, is it mutar, is it asur, is it allowed, is it forbidden? There was always a deep sense of respect for the system itself. And here what you get is an attack on the system itself. And that's what Norm was talking about a moment ago. To say that these aren't facts, or that we can't agree on the facts, or there are no facts, or there are alternative facts, introduces a subversive element that undermines the very system. And that's a bigger danger than, that's more difficult to deal with. It's a more difficult circumstance to deal with than the fact that you want a certain policy and I want a different policy. Right. There were, and that, if an election is simply about policies, tax policies, immigration policies, foreign policies, but we all agree on certain basic ground rules about how the country ought to be governed, about how the country be run. That's one thing. And then we have room for differences. But the question really is, are there certain subversive elements that undermine the very conversation we're having? And at that point, can you tolerate that And that, I think, is one of the ways why people are right now, there's such anguish and such anxiety over this election and over what's gone on over these last years. And I'm going to say something that's going to make certain people crazy. It's not the president alone. I mean, he has a certain habit of this, but really it's beyond that now. I mean, it's really a lot of people in the culture are denying the very viability of the system on both sides, by the way, left and right. And that really begins to worry you about, can you preserve a democracy? In the end, I'm a big patriot in America, but I'm also recognize that democracy is a pretty fragile thing. It's pretty fragile. It needs a lot of work, and it needs a certain amount of discipline. It was a reason why the founders of this republic put a certain kind of person in charge, because there were people who could discipline themselves to preserve and protect the system as a whole. All right, let's go back before we finish. I don't want to get too far sidetracked, just sidetracked enough. So let's go back and take a look at this one Psalm again. So here, this is Psalm 94, and it's the Psalm of, it starts out with this address to God of vengeance, God of retribution, appear. That's the first line. That's the opening line, which is such an amazing statement. And then at the end, his statement of faith, God is my heaven, my haven, my sheltering rock. He'll make evil recoil upon them, annihilate them through their wickedness. The Lord will annihilate them. The beginning and end of the Psalm, the beginning and end of the Psalm has to, the beginning and end of the Psalm has to do with his expectation that if I live in a universe with a God of justice, I want to know, I can't figure out why that God of justice hasn't shown up to reconcile the injustices of the world. And then in between, you have this alternation, this dialectic between his many statements of faith, his many statements of confidence, right? And then the great question of see, his statements of confidence, his statements of faith, and then his outrage that the God he has confidence in hasn't stepped up to perform those acts that they ought to, that God ought to. And it bothers him so very much. And that's what the Psalm is about. And I want to go back to where we first started with the Abraham. What's amazing is the voice of the psalmist, that there's room in the Bible, that there's room in Jewish tradition among believers to say, God, you're not being the God you need to be. Abraham says, Hashofet kol haaretz lo yaseh mishpat. The judge of all the earth isn't doing justice, right? I have a sense of who you are, and I have a sense of what you want to be in the world, and you're not doing it. And that's chutzpah. I mean, it's one thing to tell your boss he isn't doing a good job. It's another thing to tell the boss of the universe he's not doing a job. And here you get this notion of the psalmist saying to God, where are you? Where is your justice? Where is your righteousness? Where is that strength that stands behind me as I yearn and I work for justice in the world? And that emotion, that sense of, it's not abandonment, because he still has faith that God will someday, but in the meantime, that's what he's feeling. That's the emotion. So next time what we're going to do is take a look at some of the Psalms that deal with the destruction, because we had a moment of catastrophe and destruction in our lives, in our collective life. And this is really, really important to feel how the psalmist then responds. Let me wish all of you a really good night and a good day. And remind you that Minyan tonight and every night this week is at 5 o'clock, because we changed the clocks. In the morning, 7:30. Shabbos Torah study at 9. Shabbos service is at 10, and Havdalah at 6. And hoping that all of you take care of yourselves. And let's pray that whatever's going to happen, that American democracy survives. Stay well. Take good care.